Chapter 13. Keeping Eric occupied was a big challenge, especially when Freya and Sigurd were in school, and now, with the ditches getting high, I couldn't let him out of my sight. I was beginning to admit what everyone had been saying about him. He was spoiled. My Norwegian mother-in-law, who had been schooled on old wives' tales, claimed Eric's temperament had been shaped by a shattering prenatal incident. Just a week before his expected due date, Corey, Sig, Freya, and I had been hit by a loaded gravel truck, which totaled our car and sent me into labor, leading to a difficult birth. By comparison, Freya's birth had been textbook, except for the fact that Corey had left the coffee pot on the stove and we had to detour back home. After an 18-hour labor, I stayed in the hospital for a week, during which time the nurses taught us new mothers how to sterilize bottles, bathe newborns, and use one of the great wonders of the New World, the cotton swab. I had decided on her name years earlier when I was 17. I had skipped school one day to see a movie about skiing in the Alps, and the gorgeous movie star's name was Freya. I thought it must be the Austrian version of Francis. That was fine because, at the time, I was in love with an Austrian skier. Later, when I married a Norwegian, I considered abandoning the name. But then I learned that in Norse mythology, Freya was the goddess of love, and also the name of Norway's leading candy company. My in-laws were satisfied with my choice. Sig's birth, during World War II, when hospital beds were at a premium, had been like a plan worked out by top brass. Bang bang. The doctor had informed me that to keep the staff on schedule, he would induce labor. He asked if I had a preference as to the day. I did. It was the day I had been praying for, the 29th of May, the day between my father's birthday and mine. He consulted his calendar, shook his head, and penciled in the date. Just before Independence Day, he said. The day after his arrival, we named him Sigurd, a name that appeared several times in the list of sovereigns of Norway, as well as in the genealogy of the Gustafssons and Corey's mother's family, the Lepsos. I was released from the hospital with a brief benediction. The Lord be with thee. Eric we had named after Eric the Red, the Norwegian who discovered Greenland in 982. He was the father of Leif Erikson, the discoverer of America. But when Corey's sister, the history buff, heard the name we had chosen, she informed us that the earliest Eric in Norwegian history was the son of Harald the first king of Norway. He was called Eric First, the Bloody Axe, because during his reign he killed all but one of his 8 brothers. We all shuddered, except for my mother. She was glad we had given him the middle name of Roy after my father, Roy E. Bigham. So Mama just reversed the name and called him E-Roy. And that's what we called him whenever she was around. Strangely enough, Eroy looked like Roy E., and had the same analytical temperament. To help me keep my eye on him, Corey built a sandbox just outside the kitchen window. It worked well, but the minute I turned from the dishpan, I would hear him screaming, and I'd run out to see him doing battle with the goat. Goaty was too much for Eric. He was too much for all of us. We could never feel safe outside for fear he would come at us from behind. It was painful, even though at times it was like a burlesque show. Like the day the kids and I were out taking pictures. We spotted Corey walking up the barn ramp carrying 2 5-gallon buckets, unaware that he had become a target. I knew I should have called out, but the temptation was too great. I snapped a picture as Goaty charged him, knocking him down while the contents of the buckets splashed everywhere. The only thing Goaty liked more than butting was racing to the exhaust pipe of the truck and gulping the deadly gas until his legs would buckle, and he would stagger off like W.C. Fields. That confirmed Corey's contention. We've got to do something about that goat. I wasn't sure what, but hoping to avoid the need for a doctor's visit, I made a point of accompanying Eric whenever he was outside. One problem was the lack of company. In town, Eric had congenial playmates. But here, he had only 2 boys nearby, both older than he, whose mother didn't like the country, never had liked the country, and never would like the country. Her whole ambition in life was to move back to civilization. Her biggest objection to Eric was that he smelled like a goat and talked baby talk. I explained, it's because he spends so much time with his Norwegian grandmother. Her V's are W's, her Y's are J's, and her... She looked so bored that I was tempted to shock her. I began to explain a peculiarity in languages, which was so amusing to the Gustafssons and the American in-laws when they first heard it. It's about our word speed, hurry, rush, which, when translated into Norwegian, is a 4-letter word that would occupy the space between farsighted and farther in Webster's dictionary, if that gentleman hadn't had an aversion to crudities. I took a breath and remembered. Jesus said to turn the other cheek. She didn't wait for any more. She took her 2 sons and headed home. I didn't expect another visit from her, but one day she had an emergency and brought her boys over for me to tend. I was happy to oblige. Take your time. It's not necessary to... I caught myself. I settled them in the sandbox and figured I could be free to make the beds and dust. I heard their screams but assumed they were having fun until Eric came running in with a look of determination on his face. I dashed out, and there they were, both boys pinned down in the sand by Godey. I rescued them and began applying Band-Aids. That night I told Corey, I'm not going to let Eric play with those kids anymore. They smell like goats. Everyone else considered the contents of the barn junk, but to Eric, they were treasure, especially the stacks of old raspberry crates, remnants from when the place was known as the Roots Berry Farm. He built forts, higher than I felt was safe, but he was the boss, and I was the assistant. One day we found an old, rusty, ornate pot-bellied stove. I mused, wouldn't it be great in the kitchen, nice and snugly warm? When I asked Corey about putting it in the kitchen, he made excuses. Wood stoves were dirty, it would need a chimney, and we didn't have any firewood. Plus, there wasn't enough room in the kitchen. Of course, you'd have plenty of room if you hadn't traded in your... I know. That was something I didn't like hearing about. Something dumb I'd done when we lived at Holgate, determined to prove that modern conveniences were tools of the devil. I'd traded in the automatic washing machine that Corey had bought me. My automatic washer would have worked perfectly in Happy Valley. It would have fit just right in the space plumbed for it. But my wringer machine kept me on the brink of madness. First, I had to roll it to the sink. But before that, of course, I had to clean up the kitchen and put away all the food. I'd learned early the consequences of putting freshly washed shirts on a blob of blackberry jam. Then, I had to fill the washing machine with a shower hose attachment. For rinse water, I used the kitchen sink. Never, not once, did I get through a wash day dry. There were infinite opportunities to get soaked to the skin, all of this while trying to watch Eric in the sandbox. I forgot about the stove until one day Eric informed me of loud noises coming from the barn. We scouted out the culprit. Corey was scraping the rust off the old stove. Eric went to help. I retreated to the house, happily going about my chores, my head filled with visions of wood-smelling heat. As time passed, however, I heard no carpenter's tools, no pounding on tin pipes. Finally, I decided to investigate. I detected a familiar scent. Was I dreaming, or did I really smell burning wood? I turned and saw wisps of smoke curling from an old stovepipe in the blockhouse. I stomped inside, and there sat my little stove, radiating, and beside it sat Corey and Eric, snug as bugs. Corey explained, "You don't need it, I do. If I had a nice electric stove like yours, and all I had to do was turn on the oven, I wouldn't have bothered with this." I reminded him of something he'd explained before we moved to the country. Electric ovens aren't designed to throw out heat. He smiled in warm contentment. Eventually, I swallowed my pride. "I surrender, dear. Please buy me an automatic." My request was twofold. It would give me sane wash days and room enough to have the wood stove in the kitchen. Oh, happy day. But Corey looked thoughtful. Actually, that would take more water and put more load on the cesspool. By the way, I wonder where the cesspool is. Why he wanted to know is a mystery to me, but it seems men are more secure if they have such information at their fingertips. Where is the water shut-off? Where's the electrical switch box? Where's the nearest fire hydrant? If it had been up to me, I'd have had to dig up the whole 6 acres, but not Corey. A week later, as if by appointment, he found out. It overflowed. Of course, that meant we were probably due for a new sewer system, even though we had been assured the current one was adequate. But that's not the point. The point is, Corey wanted to find out where the cesspool was, and he found out.